On a cold winter evening, December 9, 2023, in the small, quiet town of Crystal Lake located in the northern part of Illinois, Ellie Carter, an 18-year-old college freshman who had recently moved to the area, was trying to find a way to relieve her stress after a week of intense studying and pressure-filled final exams. With her mind weighed down by worries and her car feeling unsteady under her, Ellie never imagined that an ordinary evening could turn into a legal nightmare she would never forget for the rest of her life. As she drove through the calm, dimly lit streets of Crystal Lake, she remained unaware that the flashing lights behind her would soon change everything. Officer Coster of the Crystal Lake Police Department had noticed her somewhat erratic driving, a pattern of swerving that caught his attention, and quickly signaled for her to pull over. Ellie had no idea that this simple traffic stop would soon spiral into a series of events that would completely upend her college life. Ellie Carter, an 18-year-old college freshman, found herself caught in one of those classic bad day moments, an unexpected series of unfortunate events piling on her when she could least afford it. As a freshman struggling to balance the stress of exams, late-night study sessions, and the overwhelming adjustment to college life, Ellie had been eager to unwind. She had just finished her final exams and hoped to relax by losing herself in her favorite playlist, a mix of indie rock and lo-fi beats that had always been her go-to stress reliever. With the music loud and the cold wind brushing against her face, Ellie thought this drive would finally give her a much-needed moment of peace. But, as fate would have it, a small misjudgment and an overcorrection of the steering wheel as she swerved through the sleepy streets of Crystal Lake changed everything. "It's no big deal," she reassured herself. "Just a harmless mistake. One of those things that happen when you're multitasking and trying to relax." Unfortunately, her moment of overconfidence would soon spiral out of her control. The situation escalated rapidly as Officer Coster, a seasoned and perceptive member of the Crystal Lake Police Department, observed Ellie's car weaving left and right like something out of Fast and Furious, College Edition. His trained eye immediately identified her erratic driving and quickly recognized that something was likely wrong. Before Ellie could make it back to her apartment for a quiet evening, the flash of red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, signaling that she was about to face the consequences of her actions. Her heart sank as she pulled her car over to the side of the road. She knew that her attempt to relax after finals might not have come across well, and now the looming prospect of a traffic stop only added to her growing stress. "Miss Carter, we got a few calls about someone swerving. You mind stepping out of the car for a quick chat?" Officer Coster asked in his professional, calm, non-threatening manner. His tone was authoritative but not intimidating, intended to establish control without provoking fear. His voice was steady, and while it should have reassured Ellie, it only heightened her anxiety, making her feel as though she were already in trouble. Ellie wasn't in the right mental space to manage this kind of interaction. Her life as a college freshman already felt chaotic, a mix of 20% exams, 30% work shifts to pay her rent, and 50% mental breakdowns laced with endless overthinking about her future. Now, she found herself thrust into yet another stressful moment, and she struggled to maintain composure as the pit of nervousness deepened in her stomach. Unable to resist the urge to deflect, she tried to maintain a casual, light-hearted attitude, hoping that pretending indifference would mask her anxiety and give her some kind of control over the situation. "Yeah, I'm just a bad driver, failed my driving test twice." "No big deal, officer," she mumbled under her breath, hoping her self-deprecating humor would act as a sort of mental shield. The words were intended to lighten the mood, or at least to come across as nonchalant, but in truth, they betrayed her nervousness. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, making her sound far less confident than she had hoped. Ellie's mind spiraled. "Why did I even say that?" she thought. "Now he probably thinks I'm a terrible driver and a danger on the road." Officer Coster was experienced and perceptive, and while his expression gave away little, he was already processing Ellie's statement and her demeanor. His objective was simple: to ensure Ellie was okay, to determine whether her swerving indicated impairment or distraction, and to assess the situation without jumping to conclusions. This brief exchange, two strangers meeting on a cold, dimly lit street for what would soon become far more than just a traffic stop, marked the beginning of a series of events that would thrust Ellie into an unexpected legal nightmare. As Officer Coster continued his observation of her behavior and voice, Ellie struggled to maintain composure, but it was clear she was already spiraling into panic. What had started as a simple attempt to decompress after final exams would soon escalate, as Ellie would soon learn that her decision to unwind that evening would prove far more catastrophic than she could ever have imagined. As Officer Coster leaned into the window of Ellie's car, his sharp, calculating gaze bore into her with professional scrutiny. His voice was steady and unwavering. "Have you been drinking, miss?" Ellie froze for a moment, her thoughts racing. Panic crept into her voice as she replied with forced casualness, "No drinking, just stressed. Like, very stressed." To emphasize her point, she adopted the kind of expression that said, "I'm innocent, I promise." A mixture of sheer exhaustion, desperation, and fervent denial all rolled into one. It was a look that screamed, "Please give me a break." However, the officer wasn't buying it. His tone shifted, sharper and more direct. "Have you had any alcohol today?" he pressed, his voice calm but unyielding. Ellie hesitated, her mind a chaotic mess of conflicting thoughts and half-truths. Should I stick to my story? Should I admit something, or bend the truth just a little to get myself out of this? Her heart pounded as she answered, "No." "Wait. Marijuana? Well, maybe a little. Yesterday or 2 days ago, but it doesn't count, right? I wasn't driving impaired. I swear." Her words tumbled out in a rapid-fire stream, as if speaking faster could mask her panic or create enough confusion to throw Officer Coster off her scent. But the more she spoke, the more it became evident that the situation was slipping out of her control. Her voice sounded desperate, disjointed, and unsure, and her confidence crumbled further with each passing second. Ellie's face contorted as she tried to recall whether admitting to even a minor detail like marijuana would make things worse. Was it a mistake to say anything? Her mind raced as she grappled with this question, but Officer Coster wasn't deceived. His attention was sharp, focused, unyielding. He gestured toward something shiny near the driver's side door, something that gleamed ominously under the glow of the streetlights. Ellie followed his gaze, her stomach sinking as her eyes fixed on it. There, in plain sight, was a bottle of vodka, unmistakable and undeniable. Ellie felt as if her body had just betrayed her. Her thoughts swirled in a haze, and her voice stumbled as she stammered, Maybe I thought it was apple juice." Her words came out in a half-hearted, panicked attempt to salvage some shred of dignity, but she knew it sounded ridiculous. Apple juice. Really? Her mind felt foggy, and she knew she was spiraling deeper. Could vodka pass for apple juice? No, of course not. But by this point, her words had already escaped her mouth, and panic consumed her. The look on her face must have been the embodiment of human weakness, a mixture of panic, denial, confusion, and sheer desperation. It was as though she were hoping, by sheer mental will, that Officer Coster would buy her absurd claim. But his expression remained focused, skeptical, unimpressed, and unyielding. This wasn't a moment for leniency or second chances. This was about evidence, protocol, and Ellie's deteriorating credibility. Her words, her expressions, her frantic attempts at damage control, everything pointed to one inevitable conclusion. Her situation was spiraling out of control faster than she could possibly fix. Officer Coster's sharp gaze only intensified her realization. Ellie had gotten herself into a situation that was about far more than just a simple mistake. "You have a vodka bottle in your car, Ellie," Officer Coster noted, his voice firm and unyielding. "We're going to have to check the vehicle." At that moment, Officer Coster had identified a key piece of evidence, a bottle of vodka partially visible near the passenger seat in Ellie's car. His voice was strict, devoid of compromise, signaling the beginning of what would likely become a full investigation. Ellie could feel cold sweat trickling down her neck as she realized the weight of the situation. Her chances of talking her way out of this predicament were quickly slipping, and there was no way to ignore the consequences that loomed ahead. But Ellie was not the kind of person to give up easily, especially when she felt pressure and a loss of control. Instead of stepping back, she suddenly became a constitutional law expert in an instant, as if she had just finished reading a thick, hundreds-page book on personal freedoms and the importance of the law in the life of a college student. "You don't have the right to search my car without a warrant," she declared with the confidence of a Philosophy 101 student at 2 a.m. Ellie's statement came out with an almost unbelievable level of confidence, as though she had just entered into a heated debate in her philosophy class at 2 in the morning. This was the kind of confidence many students adopted when attempting to reassure themselves with legal knowledge, though, at times, that knowledge was just enough to make them feel like they were in control of the situation. She wasn't afraid to prove that she knew her rights, even if it meant challenging authority with such a defiant statement. "Probable cause," Costa calmly retorted. In response to Ellie's confident protest, Officer Costa spoke with a calm that was almost unnerving. He had anticipated this kind of situation and knew that explaining probable cause was essential during an encounter like this. Probable cause, or reasonable suspicion, was the legal justification an officer could use to perform a search without needing an official warrant. Though his tone was steady, there was an unmistakable edge of authority in his words, a reminder that the law wasn't open for debate. "I know my rights. I read the Constitution," Ellie shot back. But Ellie couldn't stop there. She grew even more fired up as she felt herself standing her ground in this theoretical showdown. With sharp eyes and an unyielding voice, she declared, "I know my rights. I read the Constitution." This response sounded less like someone caught in a traffic stop and more like a participant in a political debate. Ellie was ready to take a stand as a warrior for individual rights, even if her knowledge of the law wasn't entirely accurate or well-formed. And thus, an official standoff began, a tense drama between a citizen and law enforcement. Ellie showed no hesitation in asserting her mental power, refusing to give in, and claiming that any search was a violation of her constitutional rights. She had fully shifted into "you can't touch my vehicle" mode, wielding stubbornness and determination as her strongest weapon, despite her fear and confusion. Officer Costa, however, wasn't easily swayed by emotion. His composure remained steady as he tried once again to explain, but Ellie had already retreated into full defensive mode. She had become a social activist warrior, determined to protect her vehicle and her rights at all costs. Naturally, this only escalated the situation further, as both sides stood their ground, unwilling to back down. This was no longer a simple legal conversation. It had become a psychological battle, a high-stakes confrontation between a calm, experienced officer and a defiant, newly minted college student. The back-and-forth exchanges added to the tension, like a dramatic scene from a psychological thriller. Both parties were stubborn, and the question remained, who would win this war of wills? Things spiraled out of control at an alarming speed. Ellie's composure, which had already been fragile after her tense interaction with Officer Costa, completely crumbled. She wasn't about to go quietly. No way. The moment the officers moved to place her under arrest, she threw herself into a full-blown protest, her voice rising with each passing second as she screamed accusations of abuse of power and flailed against the officer's restraining grip. It was as if the situation had become a wrestling match with a very feisty, highly opinionated cat, determined, squirmy, and very vocal. "Ellie, stop fighting or we're going to have to restrain you," warned one officer, his voice firm but controlled, trying to maintain order without escalating the situation further. But Ellie was on a mission of defiance, and her anger had completely overridden any rational thought. "I can't be handcuffed," she bellowed at the top of her lungs, her voice cutting through the cold air as they forced her arms behind her back and the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped into place. Ellie squirmed and thrashed like an angry fish out of water, twisting her body in every direction as though sheer willpower could free her. Her frantic movements seemed fueled by adrenaline and frustration, and she screamed at the officers with every ounce of energy, blaming them for the sharp, searing pain she now claimed to feel. "You're making this worse for yourself," one of the officers muttered under his breath, his tone a mix of fatigue and frustration as Ellie continued to flail. "You can't touch me without permission," she screamed again, her voice reaching a pitch so high it was likely only audible to nearby dogs. The neighbors on the quiet street could probably hear her protests from their living rooms by now. Her voice was dripping with indignation, her fury boiling over as if the very foundation of her rights had been violated by every pair of hands that dared to touch her. But as the officers exchanged glances, they knew there was no turning back now. Despite Ellie's shouting and thrashing, the handcuffs remained firmly in place. Every shout and every wild movement only strengthened their resolve to ensure her safety and maintain control. Ellie was a force to be reckoned with, but she was no match for the combined strength and experience of well-trained law enforcement officers. The more she fought, the worse her situation became. The handcuffs stayed on, a cold, harsh reminder of the consequences of resistance and defiance in situations that required composure and cooperation. Yet, Ellie wasn't finished. Her mind raced, her pride was bruised, and the realization that her situation was slipping further and further from her control began to sink in. But it wasn't sinking fast enough to prevent the chaos from continuing. As the handcuffs bit into her wrists and the cold metal of the patrol car door pressed against her back, Ellie's composure began to unravel completely. Her struggle to free herself only worsened her situation, each moment amplifying her panic as she fought against the officer's firm grip. Her voice, shaky and strained with every desperate breath, began to rise as her thoughts spiraled out of control. "I need my vape," she exclaimed, her voice cracking with urgency. "I really need my vape. My boyfriend's going to break up with me if I don't get this back, and I can't deal with this without my nicotine right now." Her words came in a rush, a mix of despair and clarity, as though her very existence hinged on a simple hit of nicotine. She looked at the officers with tear-streaked cheeks, her hands trembling as they pulled her into the back of the patrol car. "Please, you have no idea how much this means to me. I'm already falling apart. I can't lose my boyfriend on top of everything else." Her sobs came harder now, and her voice sounded fragile and broken. "Ellie, calm down," one of the officers said, his voice steady and professional, attempting to de-escalate her panic. But Ellie couldn't hear him. Calmness felt like an impossible state for her, a distant, unattainable emotion that mocked her despair. She wasn't just caught in a legal dilemma. She felt as though her entire world was crumbling around her. The sobs came faster now as she tried to compose herself enough to make her point. "I'll give you $100 to bail me out right now. Just call my sister. Please, please." Her voice rose to a near wail as she pleaded, her panic straining every word. She was clutching at any lifeline she could find, desperate to escape the whirlwind of events and return to even a sliver of control over her life. The officers exchanged a quick, knowing glance, each wondering just how much worse this situation could spiral. Could Ellie's desperation possibly escalate any further? How did someone go from a simple misunderstanding and a legal jam to a full-blown personal breakdown in mere minutes? They knew that their job was already challenging enough without being dragged into a frantic bargaining session over vape pens and personal relationships. For a moment, the atmosphere in the patrol car lingered on that single plea, Ellie's voice wavering, her entire body trembling. The officers could almost feel the weight of her emotional collapse, though they were trained to remain objective and professional in such moments. Still, her voice, raw and desperate, felt intrusive, as though her pleas could worm their way into the deepest recesses of their own judgment. The question hung in the air unspoken. What happens when someone's personal chaos bleeds into the very fragile balance of a legal arrest? At this moment, Ellie wasn't just a suspect. She was a whirlwind of anxiety, panic, and regret, desperately clutching at anything that could stop the downward spiral threatening to swallow her whole. The officers had no choice but to proceed with caution, trying to maintain control of the situation without succumbing to the raw emotion before them. But it was too late. Ellie was now in the middle of her own personal storm, her demands carrying the weight of 1,000 frustrations, mistakes, and unspoken fears. After what felt like hours of intense drama, negotiation attempts, and a series of calming-down strategies, which mostly included deep breaths, generic reassuring phrases, and promises of everything will be fine. Ellie was finally loaded into the police cruiser and transported to the station. It was a surreal ride, 1 part confusion, 2 parts regret, and about 5 parts disbelief at how quickly her life had spiraled from the pressures of college to a full-blown legal nightmare. Upon arrival at the station, Ellie reluctantly submitted to a breath test, despite her earlier attempts to negotiate her way out of further scrutiny. And what was the result? A surprise, though not a very shocking one in hindsight. Her blood alcohol content, BAC, was 0.91. If you're unfamiliar with the magic of 0.91, let's put it this way. This is a textbook example of don't mix stress, vodka, and bad decisions. A recipe that could easily be jotted down in anyone's guide to how to ruin your life in one night. From this point forward, the consequences came down like a well-rehearsed checklist from the back pages of a police manual. Ellie was officially charged with a series of offenses that would have even the most seasoned lawyers shaking their heads. DUI, driving under the influence, illegal possession of alcohol, retail theft, resisting arrest. Each of these charges carried its own weight, but combined, they represented the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a very long, very expensive, and very stressful legal battle. The ride to the station felt much quieter after Ellie had come to terms with the hard truth. Her life, as she knew it, had changed forever. It was strange how easily her evening had shifted from routine stress to a cocktail of bad choices fueled by stress, vodka, and a lack of clear judgment. Looking back, Ellie might be innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, but that night she became undeniably guilty of one thing, making her college life exponentially harder. In one single night, with one impulsive series of decisions, she managed to create a chaos-filled mess that would haunt her for years to come. Handcuffs, alcohol, stress, and reckless choices had all come together in a perfect storm, one that would now dictate her future path through legal hurdles, court dates, and intense self-reflection. The night, though quiet now as the cruiser sped toward its destination, would never feel calm for Ellie again. The weight of her actions hung over her like a dark cloud, proof that sometimes even small, careless decisions could snowball into monumental consequences. Sometimes, life can feel overwhelming. Between assignments, deadlines, exams, and endless responsibilities, there comes a time when all you want to do is put on your favorite playlist, turn up the volume, and let your worries drift away as the music takes you to a peaceful state of mind. It's a common coping mechanism for stress, just sitting back, vibing with your tunes, and forgetting about the demands of daily life, if only for a few hours. However, while unwinding sounds harmless enough, decisions made under stress, impulsivity, or poor judgment can snowball into much bigger problems than you ever expected. Take the example of Ellie Carter. Her intention that evening might have simply been to escape the weight of her academic worries, but a few questionable choices turned an otherwise ordinary evening into a complete disaster. Swerving on the road, being in possession of vodka, and resisting a police officer in a dramatic, WWE-like showdown weren't just mistakes. They became the foundation for a chaotic spiral of legal troubles that would haunt her for months. While it might have felt liberating in the moment, those actions had severe consequences that Ellie could not have anticipated. This brings us to the most important takeaway: don't drink and drive. Even the smallest misstep can lead to life-changing events, and alcohol impairments can quickly lead to poor decisions that are difficult to undo. Don't argue with law enforcement officers unless you're genuinely interested in having an argument for sport, and even then, it's probably not worth the risk. Officers are trained professionals, and when you escalate a conflict, you risk making a bad situation exponentially worse. Most importantly, in moments of stress, uncertainty, and overwhelm, always remember to take a step back and breathe deeply. Breathing can calm your nerves, clear your mind, and give you the mental clarity to make better choices. In times of emotional tension, mindfulness and pause can often save you from spiraling into hasty decisions fueled by anxiety, fear, or frustration. The bottom line is this: one bad decision can snowball into a series of events that turn your entire semester, or even your life, into a whirlwind of stress, fines, and consequences. Ellie learned this the hard way. While we all have our own battles and challenges, Learning from mistakes instead of letting them define you is vital. Whether you're a college student struggling with deadlines, peer pressure, or financial woes, take a moment to consider the ripple effects of your choices. Because in life, as in this story, the path of least resistance is often the one that begins with good judgment, self-awareness, and a few deep, calming breaths. Ellie's story is not just a humorous yet risky situation, but also a powerful reminder for all of us. Sometimes, the smallest decisions that we consider insignificant can turn into monumental consequences. Ellie simply wanted a way to relieve her stress, but instead of choosing simple and safe methods, she allowed stress and pressure to take control of her actions. The result was that a single evening of seeking relaxation turned into a legal nightmare filled with criminal charges and uncertainties. So what's the lesson here? Sometimes, we need to learn how to master ourselves, even in the most stressful situations. Always think carefully before making decisions, and remember that negligence can lead to unforeseen consequences. Don't drink and drive, don't argue with the police when it's unnecessary, and practice mindful breathing when life becomes overwhelming. Actions may take only seconds, but consequences can last months or even a lifetime. Facing pressure and stress is inevitable, but instead of choosing the wrong path, take a moment to pause, relax, and think critically. Learning how to control oneself and make smart choices is the key to protecting your life from unnecessary risks. So, from this story, take one lesson: live smart, act cautiously, and always consider your actions. Because sometimes, a small decision can make a significant difference in your life.